we are now recording. So thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me or haven't met me, my name is Ashley Machado. I am the Associate Director of the Center for International Programs on campus. I work with all of our lovely international students. And I tell everybody I have the best job on campus. I'm very happy that you guys are all here with us because this is a very special event. As you can see, we have made arrangements with the Museum of Art on campus to do a special talk about their exhibit, which is Permanizing Feminism. I was trying to make sure I got that right. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our lovely Miss Britt Royer so she can do her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. And thanks, Philip, and all of your hard work organizing this and everything. So this is exciting and fun because I realize I haven't gotten to do many tours or to share this exhibit with that many people since it's opened. And so it's given me a lot of time to reflect on different pieces and kind of put this together today. So I really want it to be interactive and fun. And so I'm going to be asking questions throughout, and I want to kind of hear your thoughts and viewpoints on the exhibit. And I apologize right now if I make any mistakes with sharing on Zoom. This is kind of new, this format, so bear with me, please. So Feminizing Permanence opened in February, as I mentioned, and let me come back already. So hold on. Okay, so this video here shows you a little clip of the first gallery space of Feminizing Permanence. And we're going to be looking at 4 different pieces in this space. But before we get started, I do want to share a little bit about the exhibit and what it's about. So it highlights 40 women artists from our permanent collection, and it's represented through 40 different artworks. So all of these artworks are organized based off of the artist's birth year. So as I share the works with you, they're not necessarily chronological to when they're created. So that's something to consider and to think about. But then it's also interesting because you'll start to see different themes and different elements shifting as we move through. So the first piece we look at is going to be like in 1872, and then the second to the last piece we look at is 2014. So we're looking at a huge span of different artwork created in different situations and by women in different cultural situations. All of the works are in our permanent collection, so they can be around and used in other exhibits, and they are open to research and further scholarship, which I think is a really neat thing, because what I've learned by doing research on these pieces is there's a lot of opportunity to ask more questions and to learn a little bit more about them. So another thing to note, as you just noticed with the video, is that this exhibit was co-curated by students in an art class, Issues in Modern Art, and that course took place in fall 2018. So here we go. So the first piece we are looking at right now, I'm gonna have you guys just take a minute to look at this and to explore it. I have a few details that I'll flip through, and I just want you to note anything that stands out to you in the chat, whether it be like the colors, the lines, the composition, anything that really you notice. Flip it to a detail right here. Oh. So the few of the comments, the bird nest, the flowers picked from the wild nature, the bright orange poppies that really stick out, the details on the basket, and I can move it up a little bit to show that. All right. I do think that is one of the fun things about the Zoom, is you can get really close to some of the pieces and see that detail. So I'm going to share a little bit about this piece. This one is the earliest piece in the exhibit, done in 1872 by Elizabeth Emerson Keith. That name might sound familiar to a lot of you because Elizabeth Emerson Keith was the first wife of William Keith. And William Keith is the main face of St. Mary's College Museum of Art's collection. So we house and care for over 170 paintings by William Keith. And we have about 5 created by Elizabeth. A little bit about Elizabeth. She is actually not from California. She was born in Maine, and she ended up growing up in Texas for a while, and her family moved to Half Moon Bay about the 1860s. She marries William Keith in 1864. And why I think she's such an important voice to add to this exhibit and to share is the fact that she was an artist in her own right. And in fact, she actually taught William Keith how to paint. So you start to see this connection in this line where you could even argue William Keith would have never became an artist without the influence of Elizabeth Keith. With some of the comments you guys came up with was that real focus on like the contrast of how she is painting, right? So we see a clear still life of the flowers in the basket, but this brightness of the flowers compared to that darker background, and this realism in how it is depicted. You could argue that this piece itself is very much centered on the skill of how an artist was represented in the 1800s based off of what they could create to make it look more realistic. With some of the other pieces we have in our collection, they're very similar with still life. We do have one that she did of their daughter, and one she did of a California quail. That's really cute. It's one of my favorites. But I think this is a great one to start with for many reasons, but also thinking through the composition and the subject matter that she would have had access to paint during her time period is really specific to that body of work. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next piece, unless there's any questions about this piece specifically. And feel free to unmute and ask if you do. Okay. So the next piece we are looking at is by Anna Elizabeth Kompke. And this one was done in 1900. Anna was actually born in San Francisco. So this is the first artist we're showing that grew up mainly in San Francisco, California. She and her siblings and mom moved to Germany for a while, and she actually attended the academy in Paris, came back and then taught in Boston for a while, and then returned to France. With this piece, it's actually really small. I don't know if you remember from the video I started with when we zoomed through it, but it's about the size of a laptop screen. Like, it is tiny, and it's oil on a panel. So when we look a little bit closer, you will see that you kind of start to see that cracking that happens with oil over time. But it's very characteristic of paintings of California landscape in the sense where it has this tonalistic quality. So a lot of the paintings during this time period that even William Keith was known for was having this kind of mood atmosphere that really captures the light and the color of the landscape. So you kind of have these grassy greens and golden hues. One of the more fascinating elements about this piece is that there is an inscription that's really close to it. And I haven't been able to decipher exactly who it is from, but it says "with love for," and I can't figure that part out, but then she signs it with her initials, Anna Elizabeth Klumpke. One of the things that I think is really interesting about Anna's story is how she worked as an artist, but then also her voice and place in Europe. So what's really fascinating about Anna is she had a close relationship with the artist Rosa Bonheur. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Rosa Bonheur, but at the time, she was like the genre painter of Europe. So she was about 32 years older than Anna. And actually, when Anna was a girl, they had little dolls made of Rosa Bonheur for girls to play with. So when Anna got to meet Rosa when she was a student in Paris, it was like a huge deal because this was like a role model artist, a woman artist that was literally defining and changing gender roles. She wore pants all the time. She definitely played by her own rules. And Anna was infatuated with her. And so she ends up moving to Europe in 1889 is when she meets her. Rosa ends up dying in 1899, a year before this work was painted. And she leaves her entire estate to Anna. So all of her collections and work. And so what Anna does with that is she actually creates a school for women painters that out of any nationality, women can go attend and become artists. She also writes the #1 biography about Anna, about Rosa Bonheur, and essentially catalogs and creates and ensures Rosa's legacy. Rosa herself is much more known than Anna as an artist. And in fact, Linda Nochlin used her as an example with her essay that came out about why there aren't any great women artists. And that was an example of how women are limited in their subject matters and what they have to paint. But what I think is really neat about thinking about not just Anna's work, which most of her pieces were portraits or actually, most of them were portraits. And so we are really lucky to have a landscape of the California landscape in our collection by Anna. But this role that she played in preserving another artist's legacy is something that is very continuous throughout this exhibit. And you're going to notice, and there's other overlapping stories that we'll kind of jump around and we'll explore. So before I move on to this piece, from this piece, are there any questions?
Britt, I actually do have more of a comment per se. I think it's really interesting where the inscription is located, like I mean, it's kind of in the middle, or like it's not in the bottom right-hand corner, like it's very prominent, let's say, in the painting. So when I was first looking at it, I was surprised that it wouldn't have been on the back, let's say, or in the bottom right-hand or left-hand corner, but it's pretty prominent, kind of in the middle, let's say. And so I was really surprised by that.
Yeah. And I think also when you factor in the scale of the painting, you can tell it's something that was probably very personal and a direct gift to whoever the person receiving it was. Yeah, that is a really interesting point because it is very prominent. And even just like using the darker hue, right? Like right in the foreground, it's almost like the subject. Okay. So moving on. So this work is the only portrait we have in the exhibit. And you might recognize it because I used it in the top portion of the marketing material for Feminizing Permanence. It's done by Carrie Anderson, who was a student of William Keith. And as you can see by the subject, the woman depicted is Mary McHenry Keith. So Mary McHenry Keith is William Keith's second wife. Elizabeth died when she was about 44 from heart failure. And he remarries Mary McHenry Keith. And this past fall, we've been digging into her story because, as I had mentioned, how Anna preserved a lot of Rosa Bonheur's legacy, you can make that connection to Mary McHenry Keith and her preserving William Keith's legacy. So she was the main voice and the main source that Brother Cornelius worked with to gather information about William Keith, to catalog his paintings, letters, correspondence, and preserve that legacy. What I find really fascinating about her is also her role in California history. And so this past few months, I've been digging into into her exact role and prominence. And she was actually one of the, she's claimed to be the first woman who graduated from Hastings Law School. And she went directly into suffrage work. So she worked directly with Susan B. Anthony, and actually largely contributed to why California women got the right to vote in 1911. And then later was put on the California League Committee that helped ensure that it passed in the 19th Amendment following in 1920. So this is actually a close-up of it. And what is so fascinating to me about this portrait as well is it's actually a copy of a portrait, okay? So Carrie Anderson did this portrait based off of a portrait William Keith did of Mary McHenry Keith, okay? So no one knows exactly what happened to the original portrait, but I'm a little bit curious as to what that would look like and how maybe Carrie Anderson's portrayal would have been different from William Keith's portrayal, if it would have been. So I just wanted to share this with you real close so you can see what she actually looked like and determine how closely related or not related the portrait is during that time. And the bottom is the link for the Mary McHenry Keith. We're going to be later promoting it, and I worked with the library and Sue in the library to create like a suffrage reading list that kind of ties in that history and that narrative. So we're really excited to be kind of sharing that and sharing the voice of Mary McHenry Keith and her role in the museum, but also her role in California history. And so that is the only portrait you will be seeing in the next few minutes. Any questions before I move on? I feel like everyone's so quiet.
I have a technical question, Britt, for you that's kind of weird. If you go back to the actual painted portrait of her, at the bottom, when it gives the information on who does it, you see at the bottom row, it says Mary McHenry Keith, unknown, oil on board, 0 through 20. What does the 0 through 20 represent?
Awesome question. So a lot of the pieces I'm sharing that are in our permanent collection, they have a number, and that is the number we keep track of it in our collection database. So and all museums do this. So whenever you inquire about a certain piece, you will normally give like the collection manager, in this case, John, the number, and he'll look it up. And then there's almost like an archive, an encyclopedia about that one piece that we can record, like when it was last exhibited and all that type of information and content. And it's kind of like its serial tracking number. A large portion of those numbers too will indicate when the piece was acquired. So you'll see some of them will have like 2015, which means we acquired it in 2015. And you'll see that as a standard across different museums as well.
So Brittany, so now I'm curious about this number. So 0, I'm assuming the numbers, they all sort of like mean something. It follows a certain system. So what does 0-20, like, how do you come up with that number?
So a lot of those numbers, and I'm sure John can speak more specifically to this, and this is just based off of my understanding, so I might be a little off. But from my understanding is ones that have these numbers that are kind of unclear about dates. It's a part of the collection that was there before it was systematically switched over. So there's not a clear date of acquisition. In this case, it was probably a piece that Brother Cornelius had, and that later when the professional staff at the museum took over, okay, we'll catalog it this way to keep track of it.
Thank you.
I really like her gaze in this one too. I don't know, the angling of her face, there's just something very powerful about it. And so I feel like that tie-in with women's suffrage is just like, oh yeah, of course that's gonna be there. But we'll move forward to our next piece because we're still in the first gallery, by the way. Okay. So the next one we are looking at is by Mary Elizabeth Parsons. And we have two pieces that I'm highlighting right now, which is a part of A Promised Gift by Naomi Schwartz, whom many of you probably remember and she has been an avid collector of women California artists. And so we are really lucky to have a few pieces to share in this exhibit. With this actual piece, Mary Elizabeth Parsons, it's a watercolor, a work on paper. And that's another thing that you'll continually see throughout this exhibit is you'll notice there's a lot more works on paper than canvas. And I think that's also something to think about when you think about the artist painting it and thinking about women and their place to have access to materials. I think there's a lot of these connections that kind of become visible when you have a body of work like this presented in a way. With Mary Elizabeth Parsons, she was an avid botanist. And I'll speak a little bit. I want to you guys to just take a few minutes to look at the detail of this and make comments in the chat. Tell me what you think. Okay, so we're noticing like the brightness of the red flowers in comparison to kind of the more neutral tones of the greens around. Lydia mentioned that it looks like a watercolor. Lydia, when you said that, I just like see how all those colors kind of overlap and you can see those layering of the hues. Ashley made that comment that the watercolor doesn't run all over the page. Has anyone here worked in watercolor before? I think it's one of those tricky materials because you can't take away, like with paint or oil paint where you can add on top, but like once watercolor is down, like that's it. So it has this level of skill where you have to be able to control how it moves through the actual plane. Let's see what else. Impressionistic. I love that you mentioned that because if we go back to the first one, right, and we look at it at the overall, it's very clear what you're looking at, right? But as we move closer and we look at the detail, it becomes a little bit less clear and you start to almost see that form of abstraction. And I think that's like right on the point. It does have a lot of these impressionistic qualities. I also think about the lightness of the colors besides that red, which is kind of dark, but there is this lightness to it. And you can tell that it's something that was probably created in plain air, meaning that it was created outside and in the open spaces and in that natural light, which is a very specific impressionistic characteristic. Yeah. So with Elizabeth, I had mentioned before, she was an avid botanist and she actually worked with another woman, let me make sure I get her name right, Margaret Warren Buck. And they would go on hikes throughout California and record wildflowers. And she was actually the woman who published the book, The Wildflowers of California, Their Names, Haunts, and Habits, and this was published in 1897. She did the flower description, surprisingly, not the illustrations. It was Margaret Warren Buck who did the illustrations. And some of you might be familiar with the coloring pages that the museum created in the spring that you can download on our website. Those are directly from the book and they've been edited so you can color in them. But what was really neat about this book is it shows that work of art as a form of studying and observation of natural wildlife or faunas and flora and sharing that. And so this application of the work. And I think what's really interesting about Mary Elizabeth Parsons is through work like this, she was able to financially support herself as an artist, which was pretty rare during this time. Thanks, Phil. So before we move on, was there any other questions about this piece? So then this one that we are looking at by Helen Catherine Forbes is also part of Naomi Schwartz's collection. And I want us to take a few minutes to look at this one because I personally feel that this one is very different from some of the others we were looking at. So I'm gonna have you spend a few minutes, and I want you to just write the first thing that pops into your mind when you look at it in the chat. Okay, so here, waterfall, abstract water and rocks. Okay, Picasso, cubism, shapes. The red and purple look like blood to me. Anyone else? I see a bunny with one ear in the lower left. Like now, I have my chat right on the lower left, so I need to move it. I totally see that now. Thank you. Okay, faces. Okay, I love that you're all picking up on the same things that I noticed when I first looked at this piece, is because it seems so different in the sense because you're starting to pick up on elements of early modernism and how it's actually depicted. And with Helen's work, if you go and explore other pieces she did, they get kind of like a little bit surreal almost. Like sometimes she'll have like a mountain that starts to look like a form of a human body. And so she really starts playing with these elements, but I feel like you really hit the nail on the head with like this cubist element, especially with the rocks and how she's playing with space within her composition, right? So you can really tell she's breaking down form and exploring it. So this work is done in watercolor as well, but it's very different from Elizabeth Parsons' work, where we saw the watercolor kind of blend and overlap in a way that made it unclear. Whereas here you have it broken down into actual forms and shapes, where literally the different angles of the rock are portrayed in a different hue and a different tone. And she's using lines to break that down. With Helen, she worked as a muralist for a large portion of her body of work. And I feel like you can definitely tell that through this watercolor. Because with muralists, you'll notice that they'll flatten space and work through it in a different way because they work on their planes on a larger scale. But I also think it draws attention to the stylistic of almost regionalism that comes through in her work through that breaking down of the space of what we would categorize as like the late 1920s, early 1930s. We know that Helen was actually a part of the WPA project. So she did a lot of murals across San Francisco that explored and that were public work commissions in kind of this style and format. So with this piece, I don't know specifically if it was a sketch for a mural or her just working through shapes, but it definitely has this element that you can see how it would translate to a larger scale work. One of the things I also really like about it is it has this almost sketch-like quality in the sense where you can see the exposed parts of the paper. This is going to be a theme as we move through some other modern pieces, and it becomes this deliberate artistic move. Here, we can't say for certain if this was a sketch and that's why, or if it's actually her kind of rethinking her composition. But it definitely presents some really interesting elements. Oh, so her murals too. Her mural that is currently still in existence, it's in San Francisco Zoo. So I don't know if the zoo is open anymore, or if that building is even open. It's in desperate need of restoration, but I've been told it's a really awesome mural. Did anyone have any questions about this piece before we move on? Oh, Ashley, the comment with the pig, like the snout with the 2 lines.
Yeah, immediately when you pulled it up, I was like, oh, that looks like a little pig down there. And then I see her, or someone said it looked like a bunny. So we're all seeing some type of animal down there.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, like when you break down the shapes and forms in that way, it becomes almost characterized, right? Almost takes on like a graphic art feel.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are moving on to the John and Julia Armistead Gallery, and we're going to look at a few different pieces in this gallery space, kind of a brief overview I'm showing here. And then I have another one. I know that some of you had the opportunity to visit this gallery before. And if you see pieces that I don't talk about and you're curious about, feel free to mention it, and I'll try to answer questions about that. And if I don't have the answers currently, I'll look it up and get back to you. Okay. So this piece is, by Pistola Ashuna. And I'm gonna have us take a few minutes to look at it. And once again, just let your eye explore the canvas paper and write down what you notice. Okay, so we're noticing the female forms in the water. Looks very native Alaskan Indian. Reminds me of a scene from the Beatles' Yellow Submarine. Reminds me of Art in Vancouver, Mouse Feeding Time. Okay, so there's a lot of different elements that we're noticing and picking up on. With this piece by Pistola, she actually has a really interesting story, and I kind of wanted to start with thinking through her story because I think it's really representative of the Cape Dorset artists and the artwork that came out of there. St. Mary's College is really lucky to have a pretty big collection by the Cape Dorset artists. And with Pistola's work, so a little bit about her. Her family grew up in the Northern Territories of Canada, and she spent most of her life traveling through different camps in a semi-nomadic lifestyle. So by the time she was 6, for example, she had traveled over 600 miles by dog or on foot. And that these experiences became themes and ideas that would later translate to her artwork. So let's see here. In 1922, she married Ashuna. So her last name itself is her husband's first name. And this is the part that I found flabbergasting. She had 17 children during their 17-year marriage. Ashuna actually died pretty early on in the 1940s, and it leaves Pistola in kind of this strange position. So she starts moving around with her family and trying to find ways to support them. In the 1960s is when she starts making the transition into permanent housing. And a large portion of this is because of the Canadian government and shifts in the culture that's happening. But what is really interesting is they create this resource up in the region that is essentially a cooperative where this program starts under James Hudson. And he basically enables Inuit artists in the area to come and learn drawing and painting and basically take their memories and make them into graphic prints and to be able to sell those. And so Pistola starts to do that, but what's really interesting is it gives her time to reflect on her own story and elements from her life. So during this period of her creating these drawings, she creates approximately 9,000 illustrations, and about 250 of those are made into prints. So her name itself, Pistolak, means sea pigeon in the Inuit language. She has this quote where she says, "There goes those lovely birds. That's me flying." A few of the other pieces we have in our collection are specifically birds. And so I really love that quote. So she was pretty successful artist during her lifetime, and her exhibit, it traveled as a retrospective to the Smithsonian and to 5 other US museums and the Royal Canadian Art Academy, and did a huge heritage kind of place with her pieces. She ended up dying in 1983, and we actually have a work by one of her daughters in the exhibit, Napachi Patukupi. With this particular piece, and some of the things that stood out to us is this is the first work we're looking at that's a print, first of all. It's a stone cut. And so the process of how it's created is much different than some of the other works that we're looking at. But I also was thinking about it as I was exploring it earlier and thinking about the coloring and the tones. So you have that teal and it kind of merges into the green. But this overlap of negative and positive space when it comes to subject matter. So one of the areas I'm thinking about is with this rope and how it extends from the figure at the top and it dissipates into the green, right? And then you kind of have it reemerge as that green, and then it becomes outlined and silhouette by that white line as it trickles through. And so this interesting kind of play with shapes and forms and how she's choosing to tell her story. What else are we noticing?
Britt, I guess when I look at this, like I see what I think like would be horns or some kind of part of the, let's say it's an animal that seem to be almost like misplaced, let's say. So like I don't know my marine sea creatures very well, but like the one with the very large, that's the one, and your mouse is on it right now, but like that seems like it should be coming out of its forehead as opposed to what looks like coming out of its mouth, let's say. And then as I was looking at the other creatures, if you will, it almost looked like a fish bone to me, or like remnants of fish bones, like on the upper right-hand corner. It looks like that's what it kind of looked like to me. And then you see the people at the top maybe throwing either like a fishing line or a fish to the creatures in the water, let's say. But then I'm also thrown off by the people in the water. So like, what does that mean exactly? What in comparison to the other creatures in the water?
Yeah. Yeah, there is an interesting play. And I love that you mentioned like with the horn coming out, because the student that actually wrote the wall text for this created a poem about how they thought that this creature needs to be a narwhal, but it's not.
A narwhal. I couldn't think of it, but yes, there we go. Yeah, that's what exactly what I thought. And I thought the placement is interesting.
Yeah, especially with the mouths, right? Because they all seem to have a shape located around that area, except for the people.
For me, when I'm looking at this, I was focusing a lot on the sea creatures, but now I'm starting to look more at the figures above them, and the one that I keep looking at is the one that's off to the far right. Like, yeah, and I can't tell if it's supposed to be in a tree or if they're caught up in a net or a web of some sort, or are they swinging? It's very interesting. All three of the people, I guess, on the top are very interesting because it's not exactly clear what they're doing and how they connect with the animals and the other people in the bottom of the portrait. So it's almost like it's free to. I know she has, she's telling her own story here, but you're almost free to look at it and kind of develop your own story of what's happening here.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that too, because there is this element when I tell you that it's like done from a memory, and it almost has this kind of like dreamlike element to it where you can tell there's a story, but there's these elements that you can't really tell how they add up to tell that story. It's like specific to the person's memory and experience. you know? I don't know if that makes sense at all. It almost seems like the figures at the top, especially that one, how you mentioned with the kind of like baskets or whatever that swing is, it's almost like they're floating,
Mm-hmm.
being kind of like held back into the picture plane. Whereas like with the figures in the green teal marsh, they're very grounded in that space and in that flatness of the plane.
Yes. And even the figure all the way to the left appears to be standing and solid on solid ground.
Yeah, that's interesting how there is ground under that one figure, but you don't see that with the other figures.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much to explore in this one, and I do think there's like that element where it's just so open that you just don't know exactly, right? And maybe like I think that's what's so beautiful about art, though, is it doesn't have to have a clear message or story. It's like the interpretations we pull from it. Okay, so are we ready to move on to the next one? Where are we at? We okay? So next one we are looking at, this is our first photograph of the evening, and this is by Marianne Pelfie. I'm gonna give us a few minutes to explore this one. And so feel free to write what you notice about it. I feel like the narrative always switches a little bit when we move over to photography because it has that element of realism. Philip mentions curiosity, and when you say that, it makes me directly think about the child in the front, right? And the fact that you can tell that she is looking at the person taking the photograph and very aware of like what is happening right now. That look. What else do we notice? Wondering why their photo is being taken. Not smiling. So there's not that element of like posing that's occurring, just opposing poverty against what looks like the Capitol building. Like knocking the nail on the head with that one. Yeah. So what we know about Marianne Pelfie is she was actually born in Germany, and she comes over to the United States in 1940. And one of the things that she was taken back by was the juxtapositioning, essentially, of extreme poverty and how that conflicted with the ideas of the American dream. So for about 3 decades, she spent traveling and exploring the United States as a social documentarian, taking photos that really spoke to this disparity and to this juxtapositioning and that was occurring in culture. And so a lot of these photos, they were published in magazines. She's known for being one of the first photographs on the spread of Ebony magazine. And we also know that she was pretty active in the social rights movement. So let's see here. She was one of the first photographers to arrive in Greenwood, Mississippi at the beginning of the 1963 civil rights protest, and that her photos were later used by the Department of Justice to support lawsuits against segregation, and that in Selma with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1965. So moving back to kind of like that comment with that juxtapositioning, right? So what are some of the things that we notice that speaks to that conflict or what we're seeing? So in the background, we have that prominent, like the government building, the symbol of justice in American culture. And then in the foreground, we're seeing like these broken toys, right? With this banjo that's kind of discarded. Also noticing like these trash bags on the side of the street. One of the things too, and I was thinking about particularly, Philip mentions the clothes on the drying line. Yeah. One of the things that I noticed about this photo, and especially in comparison to another photograph we'll be looking at and taken in 1991, is you can tell that like Mariana, like the way she's framing her camera is like telling a specific language within how painting was even done. So with like the children, right, we have this triangular shape with how they're positioned with each other. And you guys are probably familiar about seeing that even within like Christian iconography of like the Virgin and Jesus. You see that triangle shape here quite a bit and how images are framed together. And I feel like the positioning of it and following those rules of how painting is done is how she's choosing to move through her social documentation. So there's like a clear sense of like the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. And I think that's what really helps deliver the story that she's telling. So we have this comment that the girl in the front seems as if she's claiming her territory, as if there's an intruder. Okay. What do you see that makes you say that or makes you feel that way? The look on her face. Yeah, I think that's where like the power of like the camera is so like transparent in imagery, right? It's like that awareness and that look where you can tell she is looking at someone taking a photo of her. Like it wouldn't be the same with a portrait. It wouldn't be the same if you tried to do this in another material, right? And I think when you think about artistic choice in telling a story, it becomes very transparent. Okay, let's see. Ashley, you mentioned like the buildings that need maintenance. So recognizing like these kind of broken, rundown structures and how that adds to that juxtapositioning of the social justice symbol. Yeah. So the angle of the two kids on the right are looking, okay, not directly at us, sort of sideways. Yeah, the positioning of the figures.
But I also feel like the child in the back right might be looking at somebody else who's not the photographer. And I think that leaves a lot of, that just adds to this idea of curiosity. You have the curiosity of the child in the front, but then it makes you wonder who is the child in the back looking at, because it's not the photographer and I wonder who it is.
Got the adult figure in the background. So right back here.
Yeah, is that a person or is that a something? Because I can't see the head.
It looks to me like a figure that's kind of turned away and looking towards the direction of where the Capitol building is. Yeah. It's a really interesting photo. Okay. I need to work on my transitions. I'm like, okay, are we ready to move on to the next one? Okay.
Yes.
It was a subtle one. I hope you enjoyed that. Okay. So now we're moving on to the next piece. And this is, to me, where things start to really get fun, but I'm extremely biased. Let me go back. I thought I had another one. Okay. Anyways, you're going to have to just imagine up close. And we're going to do quick kind of thoughts, reactions, but this time I want you to type in how it makes you feel. Chaotic, uncomfortable, scattered, like kindergarten, like I'm climbing a hill, crime scene, disaster. Okay, so okay, I mentioned that this is probably one of my favorites, and I was really excited to find out that we had an Elaine De Kooning in our collection. I don't know who all is familiar with Elaine De Kooning, but she is one of the leading figures of abstract expressionism and one of the leading women artists of abstract expressionism, which was an art movement that happened on the advent of World War II, and it basically shifts the art world. So before, if you wanted to be an artist, you go to Berlin or you go to Paris and study at the academy. And this was the first time everyone's like turning and looking at like what's happening in New York, what's happening in San Francisco. And it's the first time where people are turning inward. And I love that now thinking about that, because I feel like with COVID, we're all kind of turning inward to a certain degree. So it's like abstract expressionism has this like resurgence. But this idea, there's this quote by Barnett Newman, who is another abstract expressionist. And he says that after all this chaos and destruction, where do we go from here? Referring to World War II and the idea of turning inward. And so artistically, this is what came out. And what comes out is something that's completely abstract, that has no remnants of the natural world. Now, Elaine De Kooning herself as an artist played with that, because you'll notice she keeps a title to her artwork and reference to the natural world to a certain degree. A lot of the other artists in this movement didn't do that, but she chose to do that. And I think that also speaks to how she's choosing to paint and what she is choosing to paint and why. So one of the huge game changers about this art movement is that, think about that portrait we were looking at by Elizabeth Keith at the beginning. We had a very clear subject. We had the basket, we had the flowers. You knew as the viewer where exactly to direct your eye and how, right? You think about those orange poppies right in the middle and your eye just went straight there. Here, it was like a game changer, because now you're exploring the entire surface, right? You see this red up here, and then it moves down to this splash of orange kind of mixed in with black, and it moves down to the splash of red. Your eye is continually moving across the surface, and it's not settling in just one place. So that was just one of the many ways about how this style of painting revolutionized the way we thought about art and what art should do. Another thing that you'll notice as well is that you have the exposure of the material, right? So when we think about Elizabeth Keith's, back to her basket with the flowers, you're not necessarily aware that you're looking at paint, right? You're looking at the flowers. Whereas when you look at this piece, you know you're looking at paint. You see the splashes, you see that brush work, right? You see that she's doing it on paper, and you can like see where the brush gets a little too dry, and it has this kind of energy to it. So this idea where it was more about painting these large abstract ideas that you guys definitely touched on, this chaotic feel, the scattered feel, about what a work can display from what's inside. Did this make anyone feel peaceful? No. And so it makes us think, well, why is that? Right? Why is she choosing certain colors to portray certain things? So what I have found out about this piece is that Elaine actually painted it 1959, and I'm assuming that she based it off of a visit that she did with Margaret Randall, where they went to Mexico, and she was inspired by the bullfights and the energy of what she witnessed there. And so thinking back into how experiences and movements can impact how we see or what colors we choose to represent that by. And then we have the wife of William De Kooning. Yes. So Elaine De Kooning married William De Kooning. And what's interesting too is she actually took his last name. I think one of my favorite little like fun facts about this that I just find so bizarre. So William De Kooning also kind of started as the WPA project, but he wasn't American. He was Swedish. And like he didn't get his citizenship until he married Elaine. And I just find that hilarious that he was like working in the Public Works Commission of the United States and like there was like no repercussions, like no one was even aware. Like, okay. Okay. Are there any other thoughts about this piece before we move on to the next one? Okay. I know it's been a long day, so I definitely want us to keep moving through. So this is on the other side of the gallery, and even though we're moving to the left, visually we are moving to the right. So the one piece that showed at the beginning is the one we're going to be talking about next. So that one is this one, Rioscape by Sonia Rappaport. And let's take a few minutes to look at this work. Here's a detail of it, because I think once you really zoom in on the detail, that's when it gets exciting. So if you can leave your comments or things that you're noticing about it. And I can go back to the other one if you want to see the larger version. Noticing the colors, right? So we have these kind of gray, blue hues. It's very opposite of the colors that we were seeing in Elaine's work, right? Has more of a calming sense. What's behind the fog? Okay, so almost like this overlap where it gives this feeling of like unearthing layers of fog. The texture, love the composition. Yes, very calming. The white cloud, like versus the stripe plaid, opposite feeling. Yeah. So this work by Sonia Rappaport is in the spirit of abstract expressionism, and it's not a characteristic work by her. Some of her earlier works were more figure, and then she later goes on to actually do biometric computer type art. And so there's this small window where she was doing these abstract pieces, and she was experimenting with like combining different materials together. So in this piece, I think you can definitely see this overlap of like, you have like watercolor. It almost looks like you have pen in some places. It almost looks like you have crayon or like some form of pastel. And so she's also using collage in a few different pieces at this time. I don't know if this work in particular has that collage. I didn't notice it when I saw it in person. But you can definitely see this kind of play with the materials in a very similar way of abstract expressionists with exploring that shape and form. Oops, jumped ahead. I'm going back to this overall one because I think it really captures that idea of that composition and your eye moving through and how you kind of look at this lightness at the top, and it's like the gravity pulls you down. And then there's so much more at the bottom and this kind of splash here. Does it remind anyone of anything else? And we got fog, white clouds. It kind of reminds me of like pigeon plumage. I don't know, something about like, it has this kind of like feathery element. I've also been thinking a lot about pigeons recently, so that might just be me specifically. A storm, okay. So that kind of extreme, I love avalanche, okay. So also the words I'm getting, they're expressing that sense of motion, right? They're things and items and experiences that have energy. And when I hear and see storm, I think about this lower portion, just because to me, there seems like you have this energy moving into the center, bottom of the composition, like it's not still. I almost see the shape of a head obscured by the fog. Kathleen, where do you see that? Okay.
Okay. The shape of the head, you mean?
Yeah.
So here's the chin down below. I don't know if you can see, you can't see my arrow, I guess, huh?
I think I see it. Is it kind of in the lower?
And then you kind of go for if you sort of take that as an oval at the head,
Okay.
there's a chin below, that's the mouth where you just had your arrow.
Okay.
And then almost like these patches of foggy clouds obscuring the face.
Yeah. Interesting. And like now that you say that too, it almost makes me wonder, because she was working in figural before. I'm like, okay, was that intentional? So it does definitely have that element of play, like where you can't tell for certain.
I didn't see that at first.
Yeah, you spend long enough looking at these, you can see anything.
Yeah, it just starts changing on you.
Yeah. As a side note too, we also have these available in the MOA store as scarves.
I have one.
Like, I'm very excited because I plan on doing all of my holiday shopping there. Not that I'm biased at all. Okay. So I do have this quote. Actually, no, I think we're good with her. So she recently did have a retrospective at the San Jose Art Museum, which was kind of neat because it was happening concurrently with this exhibit. And that work focused on her later work, which had to do with computer algorithms and how she used that then in her abstraction. And so if you ever have an opportunity to look up her later works, you can see how there's parallels to this earlier one, but it's also completely different because it has that kind of machine undertones into the shapes and how that presents. So there's less kind of like that organic shapes and more kind of specific mathematical shapes. And she was actually a leader in that art movement, which made it kind of a cool exhibit that focused on that. Okay, so are we ready to move on to the next one? Are there any more questions? Cool. So this next one we are looking at, we are returning to prints. And this is one by Beth Van Hosen. And I think what's really neat about this one is it's very different from previous ones we were looking at. I'm actually going to have us look at the detail of it. And once again, just kind of write down in the chat first reactions, what you're noticing. Okay, row of houses in England. Yeah, it is really interesting because of this linear element where they're so close together. It almost has this European feel to it because there's no space in between it. One of my favorite quotes about her work is that her art is based on line. Her compositions are straightforward. Subject matter is decisively limited. And so this element of this repetition of lines and space. So what we know about Beth, like a lot of the artists actually in this exhibit, she went to the San Francisco Art Institute, which was the Mark Hopkins Institute before, and I could probably go through, and half the artists in this exhibit went to that school. But what's interesting about her in particular is we know who she studied under. And for those who know about me, is I used to work at the Clifford Still Museum, which was a single artist institute in Denver. And he was an abstract expressionist. But the thing is, everyone always asked me, because he taught art, they're like, who were his students? Who studied under him? And when I saw this one, I was doing research on Beth, guess what? She studied under Clifford Still. And what I loved about what was pulled from that, because even though she's not abstract expressionist, she mentions how her use of space was really influenced by him as a teacher. And when you think back to some of those abstract pieces and you look at this overall composition of how she lines and uses this very thin line work to take up the entire surface and how she moves across the space, you can see that influence. So a lot of her prints are actually of animals. She has a lot of neat ones of animals and vegetables, and her technique itself is really detailed, where it's a layering, engraving, and etching where she goes in and adds these different layers, and you cannot make a mistake in it. It's really tough to do. And I think when you look at her work, it seems so simple. It's hard to imagine that it was so complex in how they are actually created. Another thing to note too is her husband was also a graphic designer, Mark Adams. And his work takes on, and I think you can definitely see this element of when you have two artists that work together. So they lived in the Castro in San Francisco. And so this is Castro Hill where they lived. And they would have like evening art groups, and they would invite a bunch of artists over, and they would do workshops and learning sessions. And that was just kind of like their thing. And so it kind of ties into this element of her personal story and sense of space and home, but then this overlap of artistic influence and different styles and different professions kind of merging into impacting how she does her work as well. Okay, so let's see. Are there any more thoughts on this one before we move on? I can see the gallery fatigue is coming on. Ashley, you made that comment. Not all the shapes are houses. Yeah, so this kind of element where you do have this variation of different buildings within it, the two-dimensionality, playing with the sense of space, the geometric shapes, not all. Okay, scale and perspective seem to vary. Yeah, so this sense of irregularity, right? So I feel like we're so often presented with geometrical shapes that are like pure shapes. And so when you see some that are just very straightforward, irregular in how they're presented, and you can definitely tell the artist's hand is coming in there and making those choices. Okay, cool. So let's move on past Castro Hill to the next. Just kidding. Okay, here we go. So now we have officially entered our last gallery that we'll be exploring tonight. We'll be looking at 3 different works in here. And this is a nice little quote that we have from the Guerrilla Girls, Women Make Art History. I think we've definitely concreted that tonight when talking about the different artists and how their legacies were preserved. Okay, so now we're gonna look at this photograph by Judy Dater, and I had mentioned it before. This is actually part of a triptych, and you might have noticed that in the video screening before. So it's one of 3, and it was done over a 6-year period when she was visiting Japan. And so I'm gonna have us take a moment to look at this, because I also think about the composition and the framing of this is very different than other works that other photographs we looked at. So if you guys want to just take a moment to write what you're noticing in the chat, if anything stands out to you about this piece. One of the fun things about Judy Dater is that we actually had her at the opening. So she came to the opening of Feminizing Permanence, and she got to see her work there. But voyeuristic. I love that you said that, Sarah. What I think is really interesting about this triptych series is that it does have this kind of aerial perspective, right? Where because it's taken outside of a certain viewpoint, it kind of presents it almost like a pattern, where you have like the circle of the figures and another one here. But then also like the trees, they're this continuous shape and form, but is presented in a different way throughout the composition. Circles, are they doing a ritual? The circle of children on the left form the shape of a teardrop. Yeah. You know, I don't particularly know what the subjects are doing. To me, it looks like a class lesson or like some form of a session where, or you're sitting out for lunch or something like that. But you all might have a different interpretation. The subjects are unaware of the camera. Yeah, so there's that huge difference, right? And when we think about Maureen's work with the Shadow of the Capitol, where it was very clearly this traditional, in a way, composition. Whereas here we're looking at it where the subjects aren't aware of the camera, the actual lens and how we're looking at the space is very different. Social distancing as well. Yeah, it's like a precursor. Who knew it would be so applicable today? Can we zoom in? Unfortunately, I probably should have added another zoom in slide. I don't have that technology available yet. I was doing one with the National Gallery earlier today, and they're like, look at us, we're zooming in on the image. And I'm like, oh man, that's so cool. I'm like, nope, sorry, this is as close as the zoom gets. You can move your face closer to the camera or to the screen. We're very tech savvy here. They look relaxed. Okay. Yeah. So with Judy Dater, she is a wonderful photographer. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her work. She's mainly known for her work on feminism that was really popular in the 1960s and doing a lot of self-portraits and portraits of women artists. And so this is definitely outside of what she's known for. We're lucky to have this triptych. It was a gift that she gave the museum. We had a show by her a few years back. And so we're really lucky to have it, but she was connected with the West Coast photography movement. So Imogen Cunningham was a huge artist, photographer we associate with that. Also Edward Weston, Ansel Adams. And so she kind of came out of this school of photography and how we approach photography in the landscape, the figure within the landscape. She actually makes comments because she was much more interested in photographing the figure and the human form than she was nature, which was very different than what this movement typically did. And so that became kind of a defining characteristic of her photographs. Okay, a sense of uniformity, closed circle among nature. Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting comment, especially when you think about when this photograph was taken in 1991 and where Japan was at in 1991 culturally or so forth. Yeah. Okay, are there any other thoughts or ideas before we move on? I think we're all getting Zoom fatigue. I'll wrap it up here briefly. Okay, I've got two more. This one's Suda House. So this one, I want to just take a few moments. I did two zoom ins because I actually thought of in ahead this time, Donna. So this one I found really interesting because I went into the galleries and I hadn't spent much time with this. And someone else brought this up to me. And so I want you guys to just take a moment and to think about what you're looking at. And then you can just write just like things that you're noticing in the chat. Is there a curling iron? Yes, it is. You got it right. Hair curler. Yeah. Measuring pressure. I think what's really interesting about this one too is that the title of it, let's go back because I am pages behind, is What's a Woman to Do? But what I really like about this one is thinking through the materials that it's done with. So it's multiple layers of color prints on nylon. So like the material of like pantyhose. Like I'm trying to think of like physically the best way to describe it. It's a material that you kind of do associate with certain like fabrics that are particular to the woman's wardrobe, right? And so I think the contrast with the curling iron is really bizarre, because when I think about a curling iron, I think about the heat and how it would probably melt nylon. And so this kind of like this awareness factor, these objects associated with the feminine, but also this contradiction of like what items and objects can overlap and do together. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about that they want to share. A little bit of, oh, sorry, what was that?
I was going to say that I think it kind of, once I realized that this was a curling iron, I think about kind of the beauty standard for women. If you have straight hair, you have to curl it. If you have curly hair, you have to straighten it. You have to wear pantyhose if you wear a dress or a skirt. And so for me, when listening to you describe it, kind of made me think of the standards of beauty that women are held to, and the different materials and instruments that we use to conform to that standard of beauty.
Yeah, that was articulated so well. Yeah, just bring that forward. I love that kind of comment about like the curling iron, and like, okay, you want curly hair, you want straight hair, this like either way, it's kind of like a no-win. And I feel like that that this image, like the way it plays with the materials, really captures that kind of feel. Any other thoughts or comments?
We're moving on. So sorry, I'm trying to understand. Was that it's a photograph, but it's layers upon layers of nylon is what it is? Sorry, I didn't understand that piece.
On nylon, so layers of nylon. So I imagine it's probably like a silk screen. So like a photograph that's printed on.
Oh, okay. I get it now. Thank you.
Yeah, it's under glass and how it's framed in the museum. So it's like one of those that you kind of want to take it out and spend some time with it exploring, but you can't.
Right. Yeah. Like you want to touch it, but you're definitely not supposed to do that.
One of those. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting, and the hands seem to be maybe more masculine hands holding, let's say, a more female used item, let's say as a curler or as a straightener, or whatever it is. And so I think that's also interesting in the juxtaposition of that. And Ashley, I appreciate your comment as like there is no right answer, or if you have straight hair, you want it curly, and if you have curly hair, you want it to be straight. And so I also think I think about this photo or this print of kind of defying the categories, or defying what you're supposed to be or do in this sense, and breaking that normal mold here. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me that you said that the hands look masculine, because I had that feeling too, but I'm curious like what in particular you saw that made you say that.
So for me, what it looks like, as I'm looking like at my own hands, like looking at the work of art here, I like where maybe there might be hair on the hand itself, like below the pinky and on the actual like side of the hand, maybe, where you see like the dots of like where the hair follicles would be growing. And maybe the size too. I mean, I think the stereotype is men have larger hands than women. And so maybe because it looks to be like a large hand holding the curling iron, that could also imply that as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because like what you're saying too, when I look closely, it almost makes me wonder if those like holes or pores are actually the nylon fabric. And like the layers of that, or like a variation in that, which then also like I feel like adds another layer of complexity. where you're like, oh.
I totally, now that you say that, I totally see that. Or where it's like the lace at the top, like
Yeah.
that's where the lace is, because then if you look on the left-hand side of the hand, it looks very reminiscent of what we would think of as the pores being on the side of the hand. This is so cool.
Yeah. I feel like with this too is like it's all about the materials because of the subject you're like questioning what's the material, what's the subject, where it lies, like this dimensional plane that's being mind blown. Okay, shall we move on? I kind of did a brief preview of the other one. Delphine has a comment. The nails are also shorter and not colored. Why leave that out? I love that comment. Why leave that out if you want to make sure it's a woman's hand? Yeah, especially if they're going to hold the curling iron. Okay. Moving on. So this is the newest piece I will be showing you tonight, 2014. And this one, we have entered a completely new zone of art compared to where we started with Elizabeth. So this is by Robin Candle, and it's a 1 mile drawing. So guess what you are looking at right now? Just guess.
At first, I thought it looked like a face mask, but that's because we're all in quarantine and have to wear face masks.
I love that you noticed that because I think this element, because you're just looking at the darkness of like the frame, right? And you just see like the wrinkles of the paper, and it creates these shadows that like give that reminiscent of like a face imprint or something, right? That kind of strange texture you become very aware of.
Mm-hmm.
We got asphalt, fabric, aerial desert view. Reminds me of the moon behind the clouds. So this is all a number 2 pencil. And essentially, Robin makes this comment where she says that she was really influenced by her Etch-a-Sketch as a kid, and that she was interested in ruled lines and marks of the ordinary number 2 pencil, which engaged concepts of place, time, and belonging. And so with this 1 mile drawing, it's the mark of graphite that extends a mile within the space and plane. I would have hated to be the one who had to measure out that mile. But that's what you're looking at. And to me too, it also draws awareness to like that darkness of the graphite. So it was paper, but after a mile of graphite, is it paper? Just like graphite now, you literally changed the material. Can you explain that more? What do you mean by a mile? So basically, okay, if you do like a line, right? Like, okay, this is 5 feet. I'm gonna repeat that 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet. And you do that for a mile. Like that's her process right now. Just like repeating that. I feel like I should have been holding a pencil instead of a highlighter, but sorry. Next time. It's very dimensional. Yeah. I wonder what her mental state was when she finished it. Okay. I'm getting to the point where I'm getting a little goofy, so we're going to move on to the next one. Using the graphite sponges on the side. Yeah. So the element of like the artist's hand. So last one, we've made it. So we are finishing with Diane Rosenblum. And this is a work called Artist Statement 7/15/2003, because it was written in 2003 on this date. And I want you, first of all, to tell me what words stand out to you. Tell me what it says. State. Okay, power. So I saw power, it's right here. And Power. Power stands out quite a bit. Photography right here. My statement right here. Ashley, oh, state. Is this where you're seeing state, Ashley? Because I realized I never have saw that one before.
No, Sarah's right. It's my statement
Okay.
at the very top. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But then you could be like, my state.
Yeah, I didn't keep going, but it is. But I kind of see Pentagon. Is that on the second line from the bottom at the end? That PENT. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of see that too.
Oh, painting. Yeah, that's probably what it says, Elise.
So what we're all recognizing are individual words, but we can't figure out what it says, right? It's illegible. So this was a really neat piece to discover, because when we brought it out for this exhibit, we actually had Diane Rosenblum in the museum sharing her more recent work as part of the R&D collaborative with the fall 2019 show. And so she encountered this piece that she had done years before, and she hadn't seen it since then. And some of you might recognize it because it was hanging in the communications building for a while, which is absolutely beautiful because you can't read what it says. It's completely illegible, right? So her process of making this, she actually did it how you would do a regular photography process. She was in a dark room and she used light pens, and she just in one take wrote it out. And this idea that she had some words that were recognizable, and then the idea that it's not legible, which I think it really kind of speaks to this kind of idea, okay, artist statement, right? So that thought process in a way. And so it happened one take, and then she put it through the photographic process like you would a photograph. And so that's how she created it. But it was really neat seeing her interact with this piece after not seeing it for years. And I'm curious of your own thoughts about it, or what you think of it.
So I guess as I'm reading or rereading the title of the work, in my mind, I was thinking this was done in 1964, but obviously, you also just said, July 15th, 2003. And so makes you think about what's the context of what's happening in the United States in 1964 to warrant the statement, let's say.
Yeah, and I apologize because I don't think I explained how I was labeling the works before. So I had the artist name, the country that they were born in, and then it has their years, so birth to death, and if they're still alive, it's not a death date. To be determined. And then we have the artist statement, the year it was done, and then the material, and sometimes we have the number, and then whether it was a gift or not. So let's see, all the words seem connected, so it's like one long word. Yeah, so this element where there is cursive, and I also think that's very deliberate, right? Because I think about where cursive stands now culturally, where you have generations that don't know how to read it anymore, and you have generations that can read any type of cursive, whereas other people can't. And so it's kind of like this language where it continues on, but the way we approach it and who has access to reading it is really shifting now in our current place. Okay. It's a little frustrating not being able to read and identify the words. I would like to know. Yeah. You can stare at it all day, you'll never know.
So when the artist came and looked at this work where she had done in 2003, did she recognize what she was writing?
Yeah. And so she mentioned that, and what I find more bizarre is the fact that she said she did it in one take. So she did it one sweep. It's like ink. There's no going back, right? Mm. So this element, and I also think about how confident her writing is, because I think about every time I write something and it gets feeble halfway through, I'm like, oh, do I really want to write it this way? But there's this confidence in how she actually writes everything, and the fact that you do have words that are so clear, like my statement, and power that's like halfway through. But you would think that like, how did you lose? Like you came back to like a word, to an idea after kind of like going through this exploration. But then you also have like how she puts the letters next to each other. It almost looks like they should be words because you have like consonants and then vowels, right? And so like you feel like that it should be a word.
But did she tell you like like did she decipher this piece for you? Like
Literally said it's illegible. It's that way on purpose.
okay.
And that's
So
what
she didn't want to tell. She knows what she wrote.
she loved, that it was in the communications building. She got a good job.
Okay.
Well, this is actually the last work I'm leaving you all on today, and I just want to acknowledge and make sure to stay within our time frame, which is perfect. And I just really want to thank you all for your participation and for coming along on this journey. I actually had a lot of fun, and I was very nervous, so thank you for making it so much fun. And if you guys have any other questions about the artwork or anything, feel free to reach out to me or ask now.
Thank you, Britt, so much for all the work. I can tell that you did a lot of research and you put a lot of work into this. And we, Philip and I were messaging each other throughout this presentation saying like how wonderful this is and how great this is and how staff activities should have been working with, the museum years ago, because this is so fantastic. You and I didn't know what to expect because you said, oh, it's not going to be in the museum, but I've got a lot of digital piece. Like, don't worry, I got this. You really did. You did it, girl. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ashley.
Wait, this was so cool. I was like, as Ashley said, I was texting her and I said, I feel like we are in the museum. Like, I was waiting for you to say, come with me as we enter the next gallery. Like, I felt like it was a true, like, docent-led tour through the Museum of Art. And I think that is so hard to be able to do. And you hit it right on the head. So kudos for you. And thank you so much for doing this. This blew all my expectations away. And we are so fortunate to have talented people, especially somebody like you working in the Museum of Art, to be able to put on something like this for a great number of faculty and staff here today. So thank you so much, Britt, and thank you for your work in the staff council as well.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you guys for facilitating this. This has been really fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for attending today, and I hope you all get outside and soak up some sun wherever you are, or I don't know, maybe a night sky is what you need to soak into, but we're just so thankful that y'all tuned in today, and congratulations to all of our MOA tote bag winners today as well. We'll be in contact with you to get those out to you. But thank you to everybody who attended. We really appreciate it. And major thanks to my staff activities team in getting this event on the books. So thank you all so much and have a great rest of your night.
All right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everybody.